June 2022, a sleek glass-fronted building in Seattle. Behind the scenes, accountants are staring at a figure that shouldn't exist. $1.6 billion. It's not in a vault. It's not in a traditional treasury. It's sitting on millions of smartphones, scattered across the globe, tucked away in a digital wallet, guarded by a green siren. While the Federal Reserve struggled to keep the economy afloat, a coffee company had quietly amassed more cash than most regional banks. Without a single banking license, without a single regulator watching their every move, and without paying a single cent of interest back to the people who provided the capital. The world thought they were buying caffeine. In reality, they were fueling the largest unregulated bank in human history. This isn't a story about coffee beans or cozy armchairs. It's a story about how a global corporation hacked the financial system to create its own currency. To understand how we got here, we have to go back to 1971, a single storefront in Pike Place Market. But the Starbucks we know today didn't truly begin until Howard Schultz took a trip to Milan. He didn't just see espresso, he saw a third place, a sanctuary between work and home where people would willingly pay a 300% markup for the experience of belonging. Schultz was hailed as a visionary, a man who turned a commodity into a lifestyle. By the early 2000s, Starbucks wasn't just a habit, it was a ritual. Trust was the foundation. When they introduced the Starbucks card in 2001, it seemed like a harmless convenience, a way to skip the line, a way to feel like part of the inner circle. Investors called it a masterstroke of customer loyalty. We saw a reward program. They saw an interest-free loan. The money started pouring in, millions, then hundreds of millions, then billions. People began treating the app like a secondary bank account, reloading it every Monday morning without a second thought. The genius was in the simplicity. The stars were the bait, and the convenience was the trap. Starbucks had achieved the ultimate corporate dream. They had convinced the public to become their creditors. The brand was untouchable. The growth was exponential. But as the digital balances grew, a dark reality began to emerge in the fine print of the user agreement. The third place was starting to look less like a coffee shop and more like a casino where the house always wins. Because while your money was sitting in their system, Starbucks was finding ways to make sure it never left. In 2008, the world's financial pillars were crumbling. Banks were begging for bailouts. Consumers were terrified. But inside Starbucks headquarters, a different kind of architecture was being built. They realized they didn't need Wall Street's permission to hold money. The trick was a masterpiece of legal engineering called stored value liabilities. When you deposit $100 into a bank, that money is legally yours. The bank just holds it. But when you load $100 onto the Starbucks app, you are no longer the owner of that cash. Technically, you've already spent it. You've exchanged legal tender for siren dollars, a private, closed-loop currency that can only be used at one place. By 2016, the scale of this operation became terrifying. Data showed that Starbucks held more customer cash than major financial institutions like Green Dot or Mercury. Roughly $1.2 billion was sitting on their balance sheets at any given moment. To a regular bank, that's a massive responsibility. To Starbucks, it was a massive, interest-free gift. In a traditional loan, a company has to pay 5 or 10% interest to borrow that kind of capital. Starbucks was getting it for zero. They used your morning latte money to build new stores, buy back their own stock, and crush competitors. The arrogance was palpable. In corporate earnings calls, they stopped talking about roasting beans and started talking about digital flywheel momentum. They weren't just a coffee shop anymore. They were a tech-fin giant dressed in a green apron. The money was pouring in faster than they could spend it. By 2019, the float had reached nearly $1.5 billion. Internal reports were glowing. The stock price was soaring. Executives were toasted as geniuses of the digital age. But in the quiet corners of the accounting department, a new line item was growing, a massive pile of unclaimed money that had been sitting idle for years. A few low-level analysts raised questions about the ethics of keeping money for services never rendered. They were ignored. The machine was working too well to stop now, but the first crack had formed. and it was about to cost the customers nearly $200 million. The warnings didn't come from the outside. They came from within. Internal audits began to flag a strange phenomenon. Millions of digital accounts were falling silent. People moved. People changed phones. People passed away. But their money stayed, locked in the siren's digital vault. In most states, there are escheatment laws. Usually, if a company holds unclaimed property, they have to hand it over to the government after a few years. But Starbucks had a different plan. They categorized this abandoned cash as breakage. Instead of treating it as a debt to the consumer, they moved it directly into the profit column. By 2021, that number hit a staggering $181 million in a single year. That is $181 million taken from forgotten gift cards and dead apps. Money for which no coffee was ever poured, no service was ever provided. It was pure, unadulterated, found money. But then came the twist. Consumer advocacy groups began to dig into the fine print. They discovered that Starbucks wasn't just waiting for you to forget your balance. They were allegedly making it harder to spend. Minimum reload requirements, limits on transferring balances, complicated interfaces that discouraged you from draining that last $4.20. They were reportedly optimizing for abandonment. The more frustrated the customer, the higher the breakage profit grew. It was a tax on the forgetful, a penalty for the loyal. The internal emails became more frantic. "We are essentially operating a bank without a license," one memo suggested. The response? More marketing, more star rewards, more aggressive app pushes. They were doubling down on the lie that this was just a loyalty program, but the smell of burnt coffee was finally reaching the halls of power. In late 2023, a coalition of consumer protection groups filed a formal complaint. They alleged that Starbucks was unjustly enriched by hundreds of millions of dollars. The regulators weren't just looking at the coffee anymore. They were looking at the ledger. The invisible vault was about to be cracked wide open, and the green siren was finally in the crosshairs. The legal firestorm ignited in early 2024. The Washington Consumer Protection Coalition struck first, filing a lawsuit that exposed the green siren's hidden machinery. The headlines were brutal. "The coffee company that thinks it's a bank." Public outrage exploded as people realized their forgotten balances weren't just lost, they were being used to inflate corporate bonuses. Lawmakers in several states began drafting emergency legislation to force escheatment, demanding that Starbucks hand over those hundreds of millions in abandoned funds. The stock price stuttered. Analysts who once praised the digital flywheel now questioned the ethics of predatory breakage. But then the classic corporate pivot happened. The CEO stepped down with a massive severance package. A few policies were quietly adjusted. A new marketing campaign focused on heritage and farmers flooded the airwaves to drown out the sound of the courtroom gavel. In the end, no one went to jail. No vaults were seized. The company paid a few fines, fractional compared to the billions they'd already harvested, and the world moved on. Today, the siren is still there. Wait times are longer, prices are higher, and the app is more aggressive than ever. We didn't learn our lesson. Neither did the system. The loophole wasn't closed, it was validated. Right now, Apple, Amazon, and Walmart are watching. They are perfecting their own private currencies, building their own digital walls, and collecting their own breakage from you. We are moving into an era of corporate sovereignty where your money is only money until you cross the threshold of a specific store. The bank isn't a building on the corner anymore. It's an icon on your home screen. It's a membership you can't cancel. It's a balance you'll never quite reach zero on. Go ahead, check your phone. Look at that list of apps and the digital dollars sitting inside them. Ask yourself, how much of your wealth have you already surrendered to a company that doesn't even know your name? You aren't just a customer, you're a line of credit they never intend to pay back.